The air in the dive bar tasted like cheap bourbon and bad decisions, a thick amber haze that felt nothing like my sterile apartment. I came here to disappear, to strip off the HR director title like a tight blazer and just exist in the noise. Then she sat down, 2 stools away, radiating a heat that cut right through the gloom. I didn't see her face clearly in the low light, just the sharp curve of a jaw and dark hair falling loose. When I reached for a napkin, our fingers brushed. A static shock, sharp and immediate, snapped between us. She didn't pull away. The contact lasted a second, but the burn lingered on my skin. Monday morning hit with the subtlety of a fluorescent sledgehammer. The transition from the dive bar's smoky warmth to the aggressive white light of my office always felt like a physical blow. Here, everything was measured in grids, spreadsheets, and compliance mandates. I stood by the window for a moment, watching the city traffic crawl below, before turning to face the reality of my desk. It was a fortress of order. Personnel files were stacked with military precision on the left, pending audits on the right. This was my domain. I was the architect of boundaries, the one who ensured that the messy, volatile human element of our business didn't capsize the ship. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, trying to ground myself in the safety of protocol. I opened the file for the quarterly retention review, forcing my eyes to track the data. But my mind kept drifting back to the friction of skin against skin from the night before. It was a distraction I couldn't afford. I took a sip of black coffee, letting the bitterness sharpen my focus. I was reading a paragraph on maintaining professional distance when the door swung open without a knock. Mark breezed in, bringing a gust of chaotic energy with him. My business partner was the vision, the charisma, and the storm, while I was the anchor that kept him from drifting into open water. He looked ragged today, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, his tie slightly askew. He paced the length of my office, a nervous tic he'd developed when we first launched the firm 5 years ago. "We're bleeding talent, Macy," he said, skipping the pleasantries. He dropped a report on my desk, competitor analysis. "I just saw the numbers from the last quarter. If we don't stop the turnover in mid-level management, we're going to lose the Q4 projections." "I know," I said, my voice calm, practiced. "I'm reviewing the exit interviews now. It's a culture issue, Mark. People feel disconnected." "Exactly, which is why I hired a consultant." He stopped pacing and leaned against my doorframe, crossing his arms. "Someone to come in, audit the culture, and fix the retention leak. She starts today." I paused, my pen hovering over the paper. "You hired an external consultant without vetting them through HR? Mark, that's a breach of the very protocol we're trying to enforce." "I didn't have time for the red tape," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Besides, I know her. She's the best in the industry. She's been turning around failing departments at our biggest competitor for 3 years." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Who is it?" Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting to the floor for a fraction of a second before meeting mine again. "It's Shelby." The name landed in the room like a grenade. "Shelby," I repeated, my tone dropping. "Your ex-wife, Shelby? The one you haven't spoken to in 2 years because the divorce was, and I quote, a nuclear event?" "It's strictly professional," Mark insisted, pushing off the doorframe. "She's a shark, Macy. She understands the psychology of loyalty better than anyone. We need her." "This is a mistake," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Mixing that kind of personal history with a crisis management role? It's a liability." "It's a calculated risk," he corrected. "She's here to work. I need you to handle the onboarding. Get her settled, give her access to the personnel data, just be the buffer, okay? Keep it clean." He left before I could argue, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat in the silence, staring at the closed door. My job was to mitigate risk, to enforce the rules that kept things functioning. Bringing an ex-wife into a fragile ecosystem was the antithesis of everything I stood for. I straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening, exhaling a long, shaky breath. I prepared to be the anchor, to lock down the perimeter and survive the fallout, completely unaware that the storm wasn't just coming, it was already in the building, and it wore the same electricity I'd felt Saturday night. I didn't rush to the conference room. I needed the walk down the corridor to construct my defenses, layering professional detachment over my skin like a Kevlar vest. I was expecting a battle axe, someone with sharp edges and a louder voice than Mark's. Someone who had already calculated the settlement alimony down to the cent. I prepared myself for a woman who thrived on conflict, because that was the only kind of person who could survive a marriage to my business partner. I adjusted my cuffs, checked my reflection in the darkened glass of a vacant office, and steeled myself to be the diplomat. The main conference room was a glass-walled fishbowl near the elevators, usually transparent and exposed, but today, the blinds were drawn on the far side, casting the interior in a strange, segmented shadow. I pushed the heavy glass door open, dragging a lungful of recycled air into my chest. Mark was already there, leaning over the mahogany table, gesturing wildly at a projection of our quarterly losses. He looked like a man trying to sell a sinking boat to the water itself. And then there was the consultant. She was standing with her back to me, studying the whiteboard where Mark had scrawled a chaotic diagram of our organizational hierarchy. She stood with a stillness that was almost predatory, her posture perfect, weight balanced evenly. She wore a charcoal suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life, sharp enough to cut. But her hair was loose, dark waves cascading down her back in a way that felt entirely too familiar. "Macy, finally!" Mark boomed, breaking the silence. Come in, come in! We're just outlining the triage phase." The woman turned. The air didn't just leave the room. It was vacuumed out, leaving a sudden, sharp void that made my ears pop. The file folder I was holding slipped an inch in my grip before I tightened my fingers, crumpling the edge. It wasn't the battle axe I had invented in my head. And it wasn't a stranger. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker and dim, replaced instantly by the memory of low amber bulbs and the smell of bourbon. It was her, the woman from the dive bar, the stranger who had sat 2 stools away, radiating that quiet, magnetic heat, the one whose hand had brushed mine with an electric charge that I was still feeling 2 days later. She looked different in the harsh light of corporate Monday. The softness of the bar was gone, replaced by a terrifying competence. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, locked onto mine immediately. There was no confusion in them, no hesitation. She knew. She had recognized me the moment I walked in, perhaps even before I saw her face. "Macy," Mark said, oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere in the room had just become heavy enough to crush bone. "This is Shelby, the savior I told you about." Shelby. The name landed softly, finally attaching itself to the face that had haunted my weekend. She didn't smile. Instead, she watched me with an unflinching, sultry intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a look that acknowledged the secret, without speaking it. A gaze that stripped away the office walls and put us right back in that dark corner of the bar. "Macy," she said. Her voice was lower than I expected, a rich alto that vibrated in the quiet room. "Mark speaks highly of your ability to keep the ship afloat." "I try," I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I walked toward the table, every step feeling like I was wading through water. I had to get through this. I had to be the anchor. I extended my hand, determined to keep this sterile, to pretend that my pulse wasn't hammering a frantic rhythm against my collar. She took my hand. The contact was immediate and devastating. Her skin was warm, her grip firm but not aggressive. It wasn't a polite business greeting. It was a confirmation. The same static shock from the bar snapped between our palms, undeniable and sharp. My breath hitched, a tiny, traitorous sound that I hoped Mark didn't hear. Her thumb brushed specifically, deliberately, against the side of my hand before she released me. "Small world," she murmured, the words pitched low, just for me. Mark had turned away to fumble with the HDMI cable, muttering about connection issues. He was 3 feet away, but he might as well have been on another planet. "Very small," I replied, my voice tight. "I didn't realize the HR director had a taste for dive bars," she said, her eyes dancing with a dangerous amusement. "You seemed different in the dark." "I could say the same for you," I shot back, finding my footing. "I expected a consultant, not a—" I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence without crossing a line I wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Not a what?" she challenged, leaning in slightly, invading my personal space just enough to let me smell her perfume. Sandalwood and something floral, complex and heady. "Not a ghost," I whispered. She smiled then, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that terrified me more than her frown. "I'm very real, Macy. And I'm going to be in your office a lot. We have a lot of friction to smooth over." Mark finally got the projector working, the screen blasting a blue light across the room. "All right," he clapped his hands. "Let's get to work. Macy, give Shelby the rundown on the personnel files." Shelby didn't look at the screen. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than was professional, her eyes darkening. "Yes, Macy," she said softly. "Show me everything." The next 3 weeks were a study in controlled suffocation. Shelby didn't just consult, she infiltrated. She turned the spare office next to mine into her command center, and suddenly the sterile silence I cherished was replaced by the low hum of her voice on calls. My sanctuary had been breached by a presence that felt heavy and electric. I tried to build walls out of paperwork, burying myself in compliance audits to use HR policy as a shield. But shields are useless against something that moves through the air like smoke. It happened most intensely in the small, in-between spaces. The kitchenette became a minefield. It was a narrow galley, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. I walked in on a Tuesday, mug in hand, desperate for caffeine, and found her leaning against the counter, waiting for the kettle. "You look tired, Macy," she said. It wasn't a casual observation. It was an inventory. Her eyes swept over my face, lingering on the tension in my jaw. "Quarterly reports," I lied, moving to the fridge. "They're draining." "Is it the reports?" She didn't move. She stayed right where she was, forcing me to step into her orbit to reach the milk. Or is it the energy it takes to pretend I'm not here? I froze, my hand on the carton. "I'm not pretending anything. I'm working." "You're avoiding," she corrected softly. She reached out, not touching me, but her hand hovered near my arm, close enough that the air between us crackled with static. "You walk the long way to the printer. You schedule meetings when I'm at lunch. You're building a fortress. I'm just wondering what you're trying to keep out." "It's about risk management," I said, my voice tight. "Mark is volatile. You are his ex-wife. This is a minefield I don't have the map for." "Mark is focused on the bottom line. He doesn't see what's happening in the margins. But you do." She leaned in then, reaching past me for a spoon. Her chest brushed my arm, a fleeting, accidental contact that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to my spine. It was the dive bar all over again, that magnetic pull defying logic. "I don't play games, Macy. I just don't ignore the data." The tension followed us into the boardroom an hour later. We were discussing the new remote work policy. I had drafted a strict, tiered system based on metrics. It was fair, logical, and safe. Shelby tore it apart. "It's too rigid," she said, tossing my packet onto the table. Mark was scrolling through emails, humming a tune, clearly checked out. "You're treating people like inputs. That's not how loyalty works. It's how equity works," I argued. "If we make exceptions based on feelings, we open ourselves up to liability." "You're so afraid of the mess," Shelby said, locking eyes with me. "You think if you categorize everything, you can control it. But people are messy. Desire is messy. You can't regulate everything." She stood up and walked around the table to point at the whiteboard behind me. She didn't need to come that close. As she leaned over to trace a line on the board, her hand rested on the back of my seat, inches from my shoulder. I could smell that sandalwood perfume again, creating a canopy of intimacy in the middle of a corporate strategy session. "Sometimes," she said, her voice dropping to a register that felt like a caress, "you have to break the protocol to get the result you actually want." I sat rigid, staring straight ahead, my heart hammering a traitorous rhythm against my ribs. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to tell her to back off. But more than anything, I wanted to lean back until the distance between us closed completely. Mark finally looked up. "She has a point, Macy. Maybe we loosen the reins a bit." He had no idea. He saw a business debate. I felt a seduction. I looked at Shelby and saw the challenge in her eyes. This wasn't just about work. It was a siege. And as I gathered my papers, hands trembling slightly, I realized with terrifying clarity that my walls weren't just cracking. They were already coming down. The ballast keeping us stable was finally shifting, throwing the whole ship off balance. By 10 o'clock, the office wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was a capsule suspended in the dark, breathing silence. The cleaning crew had come and gone, their vacuum cleaners humming a rhythmic lullaby that faded hours ago, leaving us alone in the expanse of the 24th floor. Mark had tapped out at 6, muttering about a dinner reservation he couldn't miss, leaving Shelby and me to finalize the restructuring proposal due at dawn. The city outside was a smear of rain-slicked neon and headlights, a blurred galaxy that felt a million miles away. Inside, the only light came from the desk lamp pooling gold on the mahogany table and the blue glow of our laptops. We had been working in a strange, synchronized silence for hours. The friction that usually defined our interactions had transmuted into something else, a seamless, terrifying efficiency. We weren't arguing over policy anymore. We were weaving a strategy together. My caution tempering her boldness, her vision expanding my boundaries. It was a dance, intellectual and sharp, and it was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced with another person. We ordered Thai food around 9, eating straight from the cartons with plastic forks, the spicy scent of basil and chili cutting through the sterile, recycled air of the boardroom. The formality of the day had dissolved with the sunset. I had kicked off my heels under the table. Shelby had discarded her blazer, rolling the sleeves of her silk blouse to her elbows. "You're different when he's not here," Shelby said, breaking the silence. She wasn't looking at me. She was stirring her noodles, but I felt the weight of her attention. "I'm focused," I replied, keeping my eyes on the spreadsheet. "Mark requires a lot of management." "Mark requires an audience," she corrected. She set her fork down and turned her chair to face me. "You're not an audience, Macy. You're the engine. I see the way you fix his mistakes before he even makes them. You rewrite the emails. You smooth the ruffled feathers. You carry the weight." I stopped typing. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. That's the job. "Is it?" Her voice dropped, losing its professional edge and picking up that smoky, late-night resonance that made my skin prickle. "Or is it just safer to be the one behind the curtain? If you stay back there, you never have to risk being seen." "I'm not hiding," I whispered, though it felt like a lie the moment the words left my lips. Prove it. She stood up then, moving around the edge of the large oval table. She didn't stop at the whiteboard or the window. She came to my side of the desk, ostensibly to look at the retention data on my screen, but we both knew the numbers were irrelevant. She leaned over my shoulder, one hand resting on the back of my chair, the other planting itself on the desk surface, effectively boxing me in. The air between us instantly charged, thick and heavy with static. I could feel the gravitational pull of her body, a physical force that made my breath catch in my throat. The scent of her, sandalwood, rain, and warm skin, flooded my senses, drowning out the logic of the spreadsheet in front of me. "Look at this trend line," she said, her voice right at my ear. She reached past me to point at the screen, her arm brushing against my shoulder. It wasn't an accident. It was a claim. I couldn't look at the screen. I turned my head slightly, and suddenly her face was inches from mine. I could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, the faint flush on her neck, the way her gaze dropped to my lips and lingered there, heavy and expectant. The silence stretched, vibrating with unsaid things. The data, the deadline, the rivalry, it all evaporated. There was just the hum of the computer and the sound of my own pulse, deafening me. She didn't move away. She leaned in closer, a microscopic shift that felt like a freefall. My body betrayed me, leaning toward her, craving the collision. The distance between us was measured in inches, but the cost of closing it felt like miles. The morning sun didn't bring clarity. It brought a hangover of regret that had nothing to do with alcohol. I woke up with the phantom weight of Shelby's hand still burning on my shoulder, a sensory memory so vivid it felt like a brand. The almost moment from the night before replayed in my mind on a loop. The tilt of her head, the heat radiating from her skin, the terrifying magnetic pull that had nearly dragged me across the professional line I had spent a decade drawing. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror, and I didn't see the HR director. I saw a woman who was 1 inch away from blowing up her entire life. I initiated the professional distance protocol immediately. It was a strategy I had designed for conflict resolution, but now I weaponized it against myself. I arrived at the office 20 minutes early to avoid elevator run-ins. I kept my door shut, the blinds drawn tight against the fishbowl glass. When I needed coffee, I walked down 3 flights of stairs to the lobby cafe rather than risk the kitchenette. I communicated with Shelby exclusively through email, CCing Mark on every single message to create a paper trail of innocence. Per our discussion regarding the Q4 retention metrics, it was cold, sterile, and safe. Mark, of course, was delighted. He stopped by my office around noon, leaning against the doorframe with a sandwich in hand, oblivious to the fact that I was hyperventilating internally. "You two are crushing it," he said, chewing enthusiastically. "I saw the draft this morning. It's brilliant. I was worried, about the history. But you guys are keeping it so civil. It's a relief, honestly. I owe you, Mace. Keeping her focused is a full-time job." His words twisted the knife of guilt deep into my gut. He thought I was the anchor, the responsible partner keeping his ex-wife in check. If he knew that 12 hours ago I was contemplating how her mouth would taste, the partnership would be over. "We're just doing the work, Mark," I said, not looking up from my monitor. "That's all it is." "Keep it up," he said, tapping the doorframe before leaving. I couldn't breathe in that office anymore. I needed air, or at least a place where the air didn't smell like deception. I grabbed a requisition form for a file from 2019, something obscure enough to justify a trip to the basement archives. The archives room was the one place in the building where cell signals died and ambition went to collect dust. It was a maze of metal shelving units and cardboard boxes, smelling of old paper and dry heat. I found the aisle I needed, the silence wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool metal of shelf 4B, finally letting my shoulders drop. Then the heavy steel door at the front of the room clicked shut. The lock engaged with a definitive, echoing thud. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the dry air suddenly charged with that familiar, suffocating static. "You're hard to find today," Shelby's voice came from the end of the aisle. It wasn't loud, but it carried in the silence, low and vibrating with frustration. I turned slowly. She was standing 10 feet away, holding a stack of files she definitely didn't need. She looked impeccable and furious. "I'm busy," I said, my voice sounding thin. "End of quarter." "You're stalling," she countered, taking a step forward. Her heels clicked sharply on the concrete floor. "You're sending me emails about font sizes when we were finishing each other's sentences last night. You're treating me like a glitch in your system." "You are a liability, Shelby," I snapped, the exhaustion finally cracking my veneer. "You're Mark's ex-wife. You're a consultant. And I am the partner who has to clean up the mess when this goes sideways." "Is that what this is?" She closed the distance between us, entering my personal space with zero hesitation. She dropped the files onto a nearby shelf, freeing her hands. "You think this is about Mark?" "It has to be about Mark," I insisted, backing up until my spine hit the metal shelving behind me. There was nowhere left to go. "He trusts me." "And what about what you want?" She placed a hand on the shelf next to my head, boxing me in again. It was a mirror of the night before, but the context had shifted. This wasn't a seductive game anymore, it was an interrogation. "Don't lie to me, Macy. I saw the way you looked at me when the lights were low. I felt you lean in." "I was tired," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "It was a long night. It was the most honest moment you've had in 5 years." Her voice dropped to a whisper, her face so close I could see the dilation of her pupils in the dim light. "You can hide behind your protocols and your blazers all you want. But don't stand here and tell me that spark is one-sided. Tell me to leave, Macy. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel this, and I will walk out that door and never bring it up again." The challenge hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say the words. "Leave." It was a simple command. It would save my partnership, my reputation, my sanity. My brain screamed at me to push her away, to retreat to the safety of the rules I loved so much. But the words died in my throat. I looked at her lips, slightly parted, and the denial dissolved. I wanted to tell her to leave, but my body betrayed me by leaning in. The annual industry gala was a mandatory performance art piece disguised as charity. It was held in a cavernous ballroom that smelled of expensive lilies and desperate networking, the air thick with the hum of 100 conversations calibrated to impress. I stood near the periphery, clutching a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking, feeling the familiar itch of my HR director mask slipping. I was wearing a black gown that felt like a cage, structured and severe, designed to deflect attention rather than invite it. But my eyes refused to obey the protocol of detachment. They were fixed, like a compass needle finding north, on the woman in the center of the room. Shelby was a force of nature in emerald green silk. The dress was a violation of every safety regulation I cherished, backless, fluid, moving against her body like liquid smoke. She was holding court near the ice sculpture, laughing at something the CEO of a rival tech firm had said. It was a practice laugh, bright and engaging, the kind that made men feel witty and important. I watched her hand rest lightly on the arm of a potential client, a casual intimacy that was likely just a sales tactic, yet it triggered a sharp, possessive ache in my chest that nearly made me drop my glass. I had no claim to her. I had no right to the jealousy that was currently burning a hole through my composure. But watching her charm a room full of strangers, while knowing the way her voice dropped an octave when we were alone, felt like a secret I was choking on.
She's still got it, doesn't she? Mark appeared at my elbow, startling me.
He was swirling a glass of scotch, his tie already loosened, a nostalgic haze glazing his eyes. He was looking at Shelby too, but he wasn't seeing the consultant who challenged my policies. He was seeing a ghost.
She's very effective at networking, I said, my voice stiff.
It's not just networking, Mace. It's magic. That's how she got me, you know. He took a heavy sip of his drink, swaying slightly. 10 years ago, at a fundraiser just like this, she walked up to me, fixed my lapel, and I was done. We were in Cabo 3 months later. He let out a short, bitter laugh. God, we were good together, before the business ate us alive. Sometimes, watching her work, it feels like I'm watching a movie of my own life. His words were a splash of ice water. The history I was trespassing on wasn't abstract. It was standing right next to me, breathing scotch fumes and regret. I was the partner. I was the anchor. I wasn't supposed to be the one fantasizing about the woman who had defined his past. The guilt was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. I need some air, I muttered, turning away before he could see the shame coloring my cheeks. I retreated to the shadowed alcove behind a massive marble pillar, a blind spot between the bar and the terrace doors. I leaned my head back against the cold stone, closing my eyes, trying to regulate my breathing.
You can't hide from me, Macy.
The voice was a whisper, but it hit me like a thunderclap. I opened my eyes. Shelby was there. She had slipped away from her admirers, navigating the crowd to find the one person trying to escape her. Up close, the emerald dress was even more devastating. Her skin was flushed, her eyes dark and intent.
I'm not hiding, I lied for the second time that week.
I'm observing.
Mark is talking about Cabo, isn't he? She asked, her tone dry.
She stepped into the alcove, her body blocking my exit, shielding us from the room. He misses you, I said, using his feelings as a shield. He misses a version of me that hasn't existed in 5 years, she corrected. She took a step closer, invading the small pocket of space I had left. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the jazz band, the laughter, faded into a dull roar, irrelevant and distant. I'm not in Cabo, Macy. I'm right here, standing in the dark with you. We're in public, Shelby. There are 200 people, and none of them matter. She reached out then, her hand finding my bare arm. Her fingers were cool from her drink, but where they touched my skin, they left a trail of fire. She didn't grab me. She traced the line of my inner forearm. A slow, deliberate caress that was hidden from the room by the pillar, but felt as loud as a scream. It was a touch that bypassed my brain and went straight to the nerve endings, stripping away the guilt, the history, and the fear. Don't think, she whispered, her gaze dropping to my mouth. Just for once, don't think. I looked at Mark across the room, still staring into his scotch. Then I looked at Shelby. The anchor chain snapped. Don't stop, I breathed. The noise of the party faded completely, leaving only the deafening sound of my own pulse in my ears. The universe didn't give us time to process the touch behind the pillar. It gave us a catastrophe instead. Tuesday morning, the firm's internal salary data was leaked to a public forum. It was the kind of nightmare scenario that ends careers and bankrupts companies. Chaos didn't just descend, it detonated. Mark, true to form, panicked. He spent the first hour pacing in circles, shouting about lawsuits and reputations, his charisma useless against binary code and angry shareholders. I didn't have time to manage his anxiety. I had a fire to put out. Mark, go to the legal team, I ordered, my voice cutting through his spiraling monologue. Handle the press. Don't come back until you have a statement. He fled, grateful to be given a direction, leaving the real work to us. For the next 36 hours, the conference room became a bunker. Shelby and I were the only two people with the clearance and the competence to scrub the breach and manage the internal fallout. We locked the doors. We ordered coffee by the gallon. We worked until the sun went down and came back up again, existing in a time loop of crisis management. It should have been miserable. It should have been the breaking point where we turned on each other. Instead, it was the most seamless partnership of my life. Stripped of the office politics and the awkward tension of our personal history, we fell into a rhythm that was terrifyingly perfect. I handled the data containment, locking down the servers and tracing the leak. Shelby managed the human element, drafting communications that were empathetic yet firm, soothing the panic before it could turn into a riot. We didn't need to speak to understand each other. I would reach for a file, and she was already sliding it across the table. She would hesitate on a phrase, and I would supply the exact word she needed. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with touching. Watching her work, seeing the sharp, ruthless intelligence behind her eyes as she dismantled a PR disaster, was intoxicating. I realized then that I had spent 5 years dragging Mark across the finish line. But with Shelby, I was running alongside someone who could match my pace. The adrenaline was a potent drug, dissolving the last of my defenses. We were tired, smelling of stale coffee and stress, our clothes rumpled, our makeup gone, and I had never wanted anyone more. By Thursday evening, the breach was contained. The final email went out, the servers were secure. The silence that fell over the room wasn't heavy. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears. I slumped back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, my body humming with exhaustion. Shelby sat on the edge of the table, her head tipped back, eyes closed. We were the only two people left in the building. "We did it," she whispered, the words rough with fatigue. "We did," I replied. I looked at her, at the curve of her throat exposed to the fluorescent light. "You were incredible, Shelby." She opened her eyes and looked at me. The air charged again, that familiar static returning, but heavier now, weighted by the shared war we'd just survived. The phone in the center of the table buzzed, shattering the moment. It was Mark. I hit speaker, the sound of his voice jarring in the quiet room. "Macy, legal says we're in the clear," he shouted, the background noise of a bar filtering through. He sounded jubilant, distant, and completely irrelevant. "You girls are lifesavers. Seriously, I'm grabbing drinks with the partners to celebrate. You two should go home, get some sleep. We'll debrief Monday." The line went dead. "You girls," Shelby repeated softly, the bitterness coating her tongue. She looked at the phone, then at me. "He's celebrating. We saved his company, and he's buying rounds." "That's Mark," I said. But the excuse tasted like ash. It felt hollow. He was the partner on paper, but the person in this room was the partner in reality. Shelby slid off the table and walked toward me. She didn't stop until she was standing between my knees, her hands resting on the arms of my chair, trapping me. But I didn't want to escape. "Macy," she said, her voice dropping to that low, sultry register that unraveled me. "Look at me." I looked up. Her eyes were searching, demanding. "We work better together than you ever have with him," she said. "You know it. I know it." She leaned down, her face inches from mine. "Are we going to keep pretending this is just about work? Are we going to keep pretending that I'm just his ex-wife and you're just his partner?" The question hung there, suspended in the space between us. I thought about the protocol. I thought about the rules. Then I looked at her lips, and I thought about how tired I was of being the safety net for a man who didn't care if I fell. The answer wasn't in words. It was in the way I finally stopped pulling away. I reached up, tangling my fingers in her silk blouse, and pulled her down. The collision was soft at first. Then the dam broke. It was desperate, messy, and real. The taste of coffee mixed with the chemistry simmering since that first night. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and dizzy, the room felt different. The lights felt like spotlights on a truth I could no longer file away. "We can't hide this," I whispered, my forehead resting against hers. "If we do, it poisons everything. The work, the partnership, us." Shelby pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. Her lipstick was smudged, her hair a chaotic halo, and she looked beautiful. "I know," she said. "So what do we do?" "We audit the truth," I said. "We tell him." The walk to Mark's office on Monday morning felt like marching to a firing squad. But for the first time, I wasn't wearing my armor. I was just Macy. Shelby waited in my office, a silent vow of support. But this was a conversation I had to handle alone. Mark was nursing a latte, looking pleased with himself. "Mace, the stock is up 3 points," he cheered. "We survived." "We need to talk, Mark," I said, closing the door. I didn't sit. I needed to stand for this. He frowned, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. "What is it? Did legal find a loophole?" "It's about Shelby," I started. "She's great, right? I told you. Best in the business." "She is," I agreed. "But this isn't about business. Mark, we are seeing each other." He blinked. "Who?" "Shelby and I." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the realization crawl across his face. Confusion first, then disbelief, and finally, a flash of hurt that made my stomach turn. "You're sleeping with my ex-wife," he said flatly. "I'm in love with her," I corrected, the words tumbling out before I could check them. They hung in the air, terrifying and liberating. Mark stood up, pacing to the window. "You're my partner, Macy. You're the one who follows the rules. You don't do this." "I followed the rules for 5 years," I said, my voice steady. "I cleaned up the messes. I managed the fallout. I kept this ship afloat while you played captain. But this is the one thing I'm not willing to sacrifice for the firm." He turned back, his face red. "She's complicated, Macy. You know that." "I know," I said. "I know she challenges me. I know she sees me. And I know that we saved your company together last week because we work better as a team than you and I ever did." It was a low blow, but it was the truth. Mark flinched. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw that the safety net was gone. I wasn't drifting. I was sailing under my own power. "If I say no?" he asked quietly. "If I say it's her or the partnership?" "Then I walk," I said without hesitation. "And she walks with me." He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute, weighing the cost of losing his best strategist against the pain of his own history. Then he let out a long, defeated sigh and slumped back into his chair. "You're bluffing." "Check the personnel files, Mark. I don't bluff." He rubbed his temples. "God, the HR director and the consultant. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen." "I'll draft the disclosure forms myself," I said, a small smile touching my lips. "It'll be airtight." He laughed then, a dry, incredulous sound. Fine. Just don't expect me to come to the wedding." "Deal." I walked out of his office and straight back to mine. Shelby was standing by the window, watching the city. She turned as I entered, her eyes wide with a silent question. "It's done," I said. She didn't ask for details. She just crossed the room and took my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. The static was still there, that electric hum, but the fear was gone. We stood there, in the middle of the glass fishbowl, exposed to the entire office, and I didn't care who saw. 3 weeks later, the dive bar felt different. The sticky floors and amber lights were the same, but I wasn't there to disappear anymore. I was there to be found. Shelby sat across from me, her knee pressing against mine under the scarred wooden table, a point of contact that grounded me better than any policy ever could. We were discussing quarterly projections, but her thumb was tracing circles on the back of my hand.
"You know," she said, smiling over the rim of her bourbon glass, "we're breaking at least 3 sections of the employee handbook right now." "I'm rewriting the handbook," I replied, leaning in to kiss her. The door clicked shut behind her. There was no going back now.
If you want to see what happens next, check out part 2, where everything unravels. Subscribe for more stories.